Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today we're discussing one of the greatest running sores in our criminal justice system, the continuing harm caused by the IPP sentence. IPP stands for Imprisonment for Public Protection. Courts haven't been able to impose the sentence since 2012, but there's still more than 1,000 people serving the sentence in prison and another 600 in the community. I'm joined by Rob Allen and by two guests, Andrew Morris, who served an IPP sentence, and Matthew Parris, journalist. Rob, how is this sentence different to any other? Isn't everybody imprisoned for public protection?
Up to a point, but most sentences are for a fixed period, a year, 5 years, 10 years, depending on how serious the crime is. You serve a fixed portion of that, a half or two-thirds, then you're released, you're under supervision, then the sentence ends. So you know where you stand from the day you're sentenced. In this case, it's a kind of open-ended sentence. Yes, courts do say you will at least be in prison for this amount of time, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, but after that you're only released when the parole board decides that it is safe to release you. And that means that there are many people who have been held in prison way, way beyond that initial period to mark punishment for the offence they've committed.
And this sentence was used on what criteria?
Well, everybody thought it was going to be for the most dangerous people. But in fact, what happened is that it was used far more widely than the politicians who introduced it thought, and I think the judiciary thought. There were 96 crimes specified that could lead somebody to being sentenced to IPP. Anything that has a maximum of 10 years imprisonment or more, so a robbery offence. And robbery could be threatening somebody with violence and taking their mobile phone. That's at the bottom end. You can get a robbery conviction for that. So there have been cases of people getting these extremely long, in effect, sentences for offences which normally merit a much lower sentence.
Andrew, you were one of the early defendants to be given this particular sentence. How long did you think your sentence was for, and how long did you actually stay in prison?
So I was given my IPP in 2007, just 2 years after it was introduced, and I was given a tariff of 1 year, 250 plus days, and I expected to do about 2 years in prison. All told, I did 12 and a half years.
So an extra, basically 10 years.
10 years, yes, absolutely.
I think we should explain that the judge, when sentencing under an IPP, would tell the accused what they would have got were they not to be given an IPP. So you'll often find someone gets a tariff of 2 or 3 years and they're still there 18 years later.
And presumably it was quite common that people heard that but didn't actually understand it, that they might be serving, a huge number of years.
How long did it take you to sort of fully comprehend how this sentence worked and that you might end up serving this huge period?
It took a number of years, I'd say about 3 years. And had I not been given an IPP, I would have been given a 4-year term, hence the 2-year tariff.
So, Matthew, this sentence began to be used 20 years ago. When did you kind of realise what was happening about it?
3 or 4 years ago, I have a friend who's a retired barrister, and he had made it his business to talk to someone who had been in then, I think, for about 18 years for a crime of arson, but it wasn't a particularly dangerous kind of arson.
No, people can set alight a loo roll, and that is arson.
Yes, that's more or less what he did. And the judge had said the tariff would be 2.5 years, I think, and he'd been in for 18 years. And so my friend told me about this. He went to see the guy occasionally, told me the difficulties of even getting a hearing before the parole board to be let out on licence. And so I got drawn into an individual case.
But before that, it hadn't come to your attention.
No, I'd never heard of it. And I think if you were to conduct a poll, I don't know, Andrew, but I would think that 90% of the British population have no idea what an IPP is.
I think you're spot on, actually. My paternal grandmother, before she passed, when I explained what I was doing in prison and all this kind of stuff, she didn't believe me, I don't think. And unfortunately didn't get a chance to believe me because she then developed dementia. She was convinced that there was something more serious to the crime that I'd committed for the reasons that I'd been kept for so long.
I mean, Matthew, this thing was introduced in 2005. New Labour were in power. I think it was David Blunkett was the Home Secretary who was responsible for sentencing at that time. They were pretty tough. I mean, looking back, do you think at that time, were you aware that that was a particularly tough climate on crime and punishment, or not particularly?
Well, I think Labour governments always have to be especially hot on crime and punishment because people suspect they're soft, just as Conservative governments have to be particularly hot on the National Health Service just because people suspect the Conservatives are not altogether in favour. And so, yes, that was very much a crime and punishment era with Labour. But I have talked to David Blunkett. He had no idea that the IPP would be used other than as an exceptional case where it was plain to the judge that the person was a continuing danger to the public. Instead, he said judges rushed to draw on the IPP thing, not least because the legislation said words to the effect that the judge had to be satisfied that they would not be a danger to the public after they were let out. So it took David Blunkett by surprise, and as we know, he now bitterly regrets the whole thing.
I mean, Andrew, as somebody who served this sentence, how did it affect you psychologically when you realised you were in this kind of nightmare scenario where your sentence seemed potentially to have no end?
At its worst, at the beginning of my IPP, I wanted to take my own life because I was convinced that I wasn't going to ever get out of prison. It seemed like the hoops that I had to jump through were just too high off the ground. It felt insurmountable to me. But somehow, some way, I can't explain to you, but I'm sat here now, so clearly I didn't go down that route.
I mean, the mental health impact of the IPP is very severe, isn't it? I mean, there are many who have taken their own lives and others who've got severe mental health problems. Did you see that amongst other IPP prisoners?
Unfortunately, yes, I did. And in one of those cases, one of those people was my next door neighbour, and he took his life on the 4th of February 2010. And I didn't predict it, but I certainly warned officers and the authorities that I was concerned for him. And sadly, they ignored me. Or I felt they ignored me. Maybe they didn't. That's my perception. But he's not here. And there was a lot of that.
And it was that sort of hopelessness that sent him down that direction.
Yeah. So this particular chap, he was 25 going on 26 when he took his life. And he'd been in for 3 years and just was convinced, like I was, that he was never getting out. And so he just gave up. There
have been, I think, nearly 100 IPP suicides now.
And quite a lot of people in secure psychiatric hospitals as well as prisons because the sentence has literally driven them mad.
Can I just say as well that in addition to the nearly 100 that have taken their lives, I know of 2 partners of IPPs who've been recalled to custody who've taken their lives as well. So the ripple effect is much greater than people realise.
So, Andrew, in your case, you are here now. You did eventually get released. What were the steps you did have to take to get yourself out?
So I did, as most IPPs are required to do, I did offending behaviour work. And so I did something called enhanced thinking skills. I think it's now got a different name altogether. I did something called the Healthy Relationship Programme, which is also called something completely different. I did something called debt management.
Were these like one-to-one courses or in groups or?
No, they'd be in groups. So the debt management was certainly, that would be like up to 20 people at a time, and it was only a day or two of intense focus on, managing money that I didn't even have and still haven't got. In terms of the Healthy Relationship Programme, that would be no more than 8 to 10 people at a time, and enhanced thinking skills and those kinds of programs would be similar. And what would happen is you do the programme. Once you'd done the programme, there'd be a post-course review with the facilitators who would write a report that would say, yes, we think that this person is ready to move on to release or open prison. which I didn't know about. Didn't know open prison was such a thing. And then it will be for the parole board. So you go to the parole board for them to make a decision, and they have three choices: either to keep you in closed conditions where you are, to send you to open conditions, or to direct your release.
So was it straightforward to get on these programs? I mean, it sounds like you
Heavens,
need
no.
No.
Yeah, you need to get on the program in order to get out. But how hard was it to get on the program?
It was incredibly difficult. I waited for about 3.5 years to get on one of the programs because I only had one program to do. The other programs were added on because I was doing nothing. So they just put me on those filler programs, if we can call them those, while I was waiting. And when I had to do the actually prescribed course, the Building Better Relationships course, it took me 3.5 years to get on it.
Yeah, and worth it?
Absolutely not. I mean, no, I say that. There were some tools, if I'm honest, that were, I think, useful. One of them is called the rule tool, and it's just about thinking and mindset. And the rule tool just stands for, is your thinking realistic? Is it useful? Is it logical? And is there evidence to support it? It's still there. So the fact that it's still there means that something worked. But having said that, I think that a lot of these programs, sadly, are untested. The accreditation I might question. But, you know, I've done them now, so it is kind of what it is.
Did other people have to wait just as long as you for programs?
Yes, yeah, they did. Some people struggled even more. I mean, as I say, I mentored, and so in one particular chap's case, he couldn't read and write, so it was deemed that he needed somebody to help support him through it. He didn't want that to be an officer or a member of staff. He wanted it to be a prisoner, and he asked me if I would do it. They okayed it. So I supported him through that. And one of the really big bits about some of these courses is that you have to write your life story, and then you have to connect with it and read it to a group or read it to somebody. In the one-to-one situation, in his case, he articulated it to me and I read it, which was a really emotional time. But it allowed him to get through to get a recommendation for open conditions. He didn't get a release direction or a release suggestion from staff. And I just wonder sometimes what would have happened had that not happened. And it doesn't have to have been me, but the fact that he wanted a prisoner rather than a member of staff, how would they have facilitated that? So I just question the impetus of some of these programs for people and how they get out the other side. For me, I was accused of being a bit manipulative, and you know what? I'll hold my hands up. Yes, I was, because I wanted to get out. And I find it incredible that one probation officer wrote in my report that I was only motivated to leave prison.
Who knew?
Yeah. So yeah, I struggled with it. I read it at the time and I was seething, but I look at it now and I laugh because I just think, what on earth was going on? You know.
I mean, Matthew, in a way, it sounds like IPP prisoners like Andrew sort of had to prove a negative, that they weren't dangerous and therefore could be released. I mean, do you think that's a fair way of making decisions about people or not?
Well, I think that probably goes to the whole issue that parole boards have to deal with, the proof of a negative. I suppose that eagerness to get onto one of these courses and take these courses is in itself evidence that someone has sort of got to grips with the situation and wants to get out of it. I wondered, Andrew, do all IPP prisoners want to get onto these courses, or are there some who just give up?
No, there are definitely some that give up. And I think now, sort of 20 years on with the legacy of IPP, there are some I know of that literally don't engage at all. They're very reluctant to be involved in anything outside of their cells.
They've become totally institutionalised.
Completely and utterly, yeah. So it's a really difficult place to be. And this is probably one of the reasons I keep going back into prisons, because I just feel like no one should be left behind. I want to see an end to IPP.
So you eventually got out, and presumably then you were on this thing called licence, this sort of supervised release with conditions and requirements. And if you failed to meet those, I guess you could have been sent back. What were the sort of requirements or conditions that you had?
There is one very vague entry on everybody's licence, actually. I think it's number 5, and it says must be of good behaviour. And one of the examples I gave somebody about this is that, and I don't do this, by the way, but if I was to say fair evade, which is a civil offence, I could be recalled back to custody if I was on licence, because it's deemed of not being of good behaviour. Whereas any Joe public would simply be given a fine and a slap on the wrist and told to top up their oyster and behave themselves. So I felt that was a little bit unfair, a little bit vague. There were other bits and pieces about not entering the area where the offence was committed, and I had no issues with that because I wasn't originally from that area.
Do you have to see a probation officer every month? Or?
Yeah, I think it was weekly, actually. It started weekly, then it was bi-weekly, then it was monthly, and then it just decreased as time went on. And the other thing I think that's probably important to highlight is that I came out of prison literally in December 2019, and by March of 2020, we were in lockdown. So I had lots of people calling me saying, "Are you okay?" And I would say, well, the good thing about prison is it's taught me how to deal with lockdown. But the other thing about that is that supervision was incredibly difficult. So most of it was done by phone because it was impractical to visit me.
You were saying, Andrew, that just bad behaviour or the most minor infraction could cause your licence to be revoked. I think that has been changed. I think when Alex Chalk was Justice Minister, that disproportion between the size of some misdemeanour and the original crime has been removed.
I think what he did was he reduced the amount of time of the actual licence period, this period during which if you do any kind of misdemeanour, you could go back into prison. I think the problem hasn't been completely eliminated because I think what happens is people have been institutionalised, so they do come out, and even quite soon after coming out, when they're still on licence, they can get drunk or something and come back to their hostel late, and that can send them back into prison. So the period where you're in this kind of jeopardy is shorter.
Yes.
And that was Alex Chalk, but it still exists.
It used to be that you'd come out and it would be 10 years minimum before you could even apply to have supervision lifted.
So you had to be under good behaviour for 10 years.
That was initially what it was. What Alex Chalk did was he halved that to 5 years, but what's happened with this 5 years is that if you come out of custody on an IPP, it's 3 years. You can apply to have it lifted. And if the parole board say no for any reason, after a further 2 years, the licence will automatically drop off. So it's 5 years total. And actually, my licence has gone. My licence went last year. So I've been one of the early beneficiaries of his new policy.
I just want to get the vocabulary clear because I'm a complete layman. When one talks about the termination of a licence, that's a good thing, is it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so when you're sort of pulled back in because of some misdemeanour...
That's recall.
Recall.
Yes, recall.
Got it. Thank you.
When my licence was terminated, I rang my mum to tell her. I said, "Mum, my licence has been terminated." She said, "Why? You're not allowed to drive anymore." And I said, no, not that licence, my prison licence. So she was really over the moon.
But over the years, and even still, there are quite a lot of people recalled for minor stuff, aren't there?
There are. And one of the drums I've been beating a little bit lately is that under this new termination of licence thing, about 1,800 people's licences have been terminated. And one of the things I keep saying is that the sky hasn't suddenly fallen in, the world hasn't ended. But the whole thing with recall is still there for those that are just coming out now.
But there are still some people, are there not, in prison who've never been released at all from an IPP sentence that presumably must have been imposed before 2012 when the sentence wasn't allowed to be made any longer. Several hundred, I think, who've never been...
650 or thereabouts.
Who've not been out.
Released.
So they've not been out and recalled, they've never been out.
Yes, correct, yeah.
And what's the answer for that? Is that just a question of them going on these courses and being able to persuade the parole board?
But as Andrew said, some have just given up. So, you know, computer says you must go on a course, and if you're so lacking in motivation you won't go on the course, then presumably computer says you stay in.
Yeah, I think that is about the size of it, really.
And I think the other thing is, at least this was the case in the case that I followed, after a while the person becomes a bit aggressive and truculent and more difficult as far as prison officers are concerned. And that, of course, in itself becomes a case for not letting them out. And then you don't let them out and they get even more difficult and you're into a vicious circle.
Yeah, you are. And I really don't know what the solution is to that. It worries me because, unfortunately, the state has done this to them. So
broken them, really.
Yeah, and it's for the state really to unpick that as best they can. There is something called the IPP Action Plan, and there's a new iteration of it recently. I don't know that it's much better than the previous one.
This is the government action plan.
Yes, yeah. So the action plan is supposed to kind of create this traffic light system of really kind of prioritising people literally by red, amber and green. And I just don't know how much that is going to do, because if your mental health is deteriorated and you're in that place where you are being aggressive, then that's not going to change. It's going to be a concern for the parole board, and equally people are not going to get released. And UNGRIP, the United Group for the Reform of IPP,
they're brilliant.
They are.
Yeah.
They've released some figures, and they're frightening, because at the current rate, so as we are today, of release, it will take another 11 years for everybody on an IPP to be released. That would be 36 years after the introduction of IPP and 24 years since its abolition, and that's just shocking.
It is. Matthew, I want to know what has happened to the man your barrister friend was
he is out on license.
On
license, yes.
Yeah.
He did, but only after many years of trying. His principal difficulty, as Andrew sort of indicated, was actually getting onto courses and getting a hearing before the parole board. It's all very well for the government to have plans, but if the parole board is just too busy, if the backlog is too great, then you can't go through the hoops that the government may, in theory, have put in place for you.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've got to say about these courses, because I've done research into it, which makes it even more Kafkaesque, I think, is that the government actually doesn't know whether the courses have any impact on offending because they've never
They'd probably
evaluated
rather not
them.
know.
Maybe not, but it seems like you've got to go on a course, and we think it's a great course, but we don't actually know whether it has any impact on offending when you get out. So to me, that makes it doubly worse that they're forcing them to go on these courses.
Well, you won't hear an argument from me.
No.
I mean, one of the proposals that has been made, I think, by a group of MPs some years ago was that there should be a kind of resentencing exercise for all of these people. So they got rid of the sentence in 2012. Courts couldn't impose it thereafter. It left the people who were already subject to it. I think the Justice Committee said, shouldn't there be an exercise in which people are effectively given a fresh, determinate sentence? Matthew, do you think there's some merit in that?
Oh, there's complete merit in that. I suppose the reason why Ken Clarke, when he was Justice Secretary, he was the person who abolished IPP, but not for people already on it. One of the reasons for not wanting to just let everybody out, so to speak, was that there would be some people there who had been so damaged or were anyway dangerous individuals. There must have been 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people, and you can't just let 7,000 people out of prison. I don't see any way round looking at each case, and that would be very expensive in terms of time and of manpower, but in the end, every case must be judged on its individual merits.
And actually, I understand from Andrea Coomber, who runs the Howard League, that quite a few cases have gone to the Court of Appeal, and actually the original sentence has been overturned. So that's the way that some people have got out.
Overturned in the sense that they've been found not guilty?
Yes.
I see, yes.
Or that the sentence was inappropriate, is it?
Probably that the sentence was inappropriate, because the Court of Appeal can either overturn the conviction or the sentence. So maybe they've just gone for the sentence.
So obviously there is a bit of risk aversion on the part of the government that you can kind of understand, I guess.
I completely understand it. You're terrified of headlines in the Daily Mail saying, 2,000 prisoners are now at liberty. You'd only need one or two to reoffend in a serious way for much of the media to be in uproar that they'd ever been let out in the first place. I think it's a really knotty problem, because there probably are people who will just have to stay in, should stay in. I can't speak for all these hundreds of people.
What do you think about that, Andrew? Do you think there are some people that an IPP-style sentence perhaps was a suitable approach for?
There's a number of things going through my mind, and one of them is that I can remember being, I'm sure, sat in prison and watching Matthew on Channel 5, I think. So it just feels a bit surreal to be sat here completely and utterly agreeing with everything that he's just said. See, one of the things I've often said in custody and outside of custody is I don't actually fully, completely disagree with IPP. I think that there was probably a need for something like it. I think that for my particular offence, prison was inevitable. I just don't think that the IPP was necessarily the way to go. I think it was badly managed and badly rolled out, because originally by David Blunkett's admission, it was designed for no more than about 900 to 1,000 of the most serious offenders, and 8,000 plus people got them. I think that there are some people who are going to be completely lost to us, unfortunately, who probably will have to remain in custody. Sadly, the state has created that. But I think what needs to happen with this is, yes, a resentencing exercise could and should happen. I think the other thing that needs to happen is we need to look at the people who can safely be released, and there are a number of them.
Obviously, the IPP was attached to somebody originally because they were deemed dangerous, whatever that means. Do you think in the end that politicians still a bit believe that, and that's part of the problem with getting change?
To some extent, and I had a conversation with a couple of judges who sentenced people to IPPs, and we were able to compare notes and things. So I think there is some reticence, but one of the things that occurs to me, and I was speaking to a guy who was on an IPP in a similar situation to myself, he got out of prison and bumped into the victim of his offence. And that individual had no idea he'd been released. So my question with this is always, who are we protecting? Because if she, and it was a she, had no idea he'd been released, talking about public protection and then being really risk averse and really terrified that people are going to come out and commit offences, in that scenario, it makes absolutely no sense. The other thing is, I was kept in on the basis that I was dangerous. I don't think that I was a threat to anybody. But from open prison, I was going on day release to a well-known advice charity giving advice to members of the public. So how on earth can I have been a danger to the public? It makes absolutely no sense. So I think we just need to make sense of nonsense and really end this thing safely.
Now, you say politicians may have a lurking suspicion that some of these people really are dangerous. Well, their suspicion would be right. We let prisoners out on parole or because their sentences have been fulfilled all the time, whom we suspect are dangerous. Every day the prison door opens to let some people out, we know very well that some of them may be dangerous, but they've served their sentence. And this philosophical difference between serving your sentence and somebody making a judgment as to whether you're dangerous or not, I think is very important.
Although I think the parole board would say that the percentage of people that they release who go on to commit a serious further offence is actually tiny, well under 1%, I think. But arguably, perhaps they're overcautious in order to retain that. Anyway, it's a fascinating and complex discussion, which sadly we need to bring to a halt. The way we end these is to ask each of our guests, if you were in charge of the system, if you were Lord Chancellor, what one thing would you do to significantly reduce the number of IPPs in prison? Andrew, you go first.
I think that all of the IPPs in open prison should be released because they've proven, I think, to some extent, just by their presence in an open prison from which they could abscond at any time, that they are safe enough to be managed in the community.
Well, I was the Member of Parliament for an open prison, Sudbury, and I used to visit, and I completely agree with Andrew. You can get out any time you like. There'll be consequences, but you can. And if somebody can spend a reasonable time there and behave, I think that should be enough. That should be evidence in itself that they should be let out. But as to what I would do, I just can't get past the need to review every case. And I know that would be expensive and time-consuming, but every case will be different. And I'm sure there are some people whom we have so broken by being put in prison that now they've just got to stay there. But you'd have to look at them one by one.
Mm-hmm. Penelope, what about you?
I'm interested in this recall question, and I know that it has been improved in terms of the licence period being shorter. But what can still happen is recall is about the decision of one probation officer about an incident like, say, somebody got drunk and came home after 10 o'clock or whatever. And this is a major thing, sending somebody back into prison if they haven't committed another offence. And I think that decision should be reviewed by somebody else, maybe a judge or a magistrate or somebody like that. It needs to be rubber stamped, and that would benefit other prisoners as well. What about you, Rob?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. I'm going to cheat a bit by saying I think there's a big lesson here about what goes wrong with legislation sometimes. The numbers who got on this sentence were far in excess of what was anticipated. The scrutiny that the House of Commons and the House of Lords gave to it clearly fell short in some way. And I just hope we need to find a way that proper estimates are made of its impact, proper scrutiny given to measures like this if they're considered in the future.
I agree, and I would say criminal justice is littered with legislation which was poorly scrutinised when it went through Parliament, and then we have to reap the consequences. Thanks, Matthew, Andrew and Rob, for an enlightening, if slightly depressing discussion. Refer to our programme notes for more information about the history of IPP sentences and current campaigning, including by the Howard League, to get the prisoners released. And goodbye till next time.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.